Okay, let's get that out of there. Too much bright light. There you go. It's a little better. Testing, testing. Looks like microphone is on fine. Just gonna finish posting a couple of things in the middle. Get started. Okay. How to be like seated in the perfect position in order for the lighting to be proper? Because like using 3 lamps and trying to like put yourself in the center. I mean, it's not that different from like when you think of any kind of theater and stuff like that. If you're familiar with like theater lighting and stuff like that, and of course, it's like tons of different lights all hitting the stage, right? And so stage positioning is like super important because of that, right? Because the if you're off by a little bit, it can drastically change what the stage looks like and how people um, appear, excuse me, on stage can drastically change. So it's kind of like that even when you're. I mean, every streamer knows that too, right? Because obviously they would need decent lighting aside from like using the room lights to be the main source of light in the room, right? While they're doing any kind of streaming or video stuff, right? Of course, the other thing too is that I live in an old house that half the lights don't work in here, and it's we should call it an electrician, but at the same time, there's wow, just lots of hesitation too. One is like it's expensive to rewire a lot of things, and especially in an old house like this, right? We basically have to do like a whole like top down renovation, right? And that would be hella expensive too. You know, have to be move out of the house for a while they do that and other things like that, right? It's pretty crazy, be complex, and no one in the house really wants to deal with that. So that's why we don't get the lights fixed. But anyway, hello and welcome to the Stream Parson podcast. And today we're going to talk about thankfulness. It's funny because, I'm a guy living in Canada, and we're doing a thankfulness stream on the week of American Thanksgiving, which news to me, apparently in the United States, a lot of people tend to get the week off for American Thanksgiving. I thought it was kind of like how we do Thanksgiving in Canada, where like you just get the one day, really, right? You just get a long weekend kind of thing. I mean, I guess it depends where you are in your workplace or your school or whatever. But I remember I was talking to some guys and they're like, "Oh, we're going to like so and so place, going on like little trips for the week for Thanksgiving." It's like, wait a minute, but I thought Thanksgiving was really just the one day. But I mean, what do I know, right? I mean, maybe America just do things differently, and of course, Thanksgiving in the States falls on a different day, right, than it does in Canada. In Canada, it falls on the second Monday of October, usually. Sometimes the first one, Monday, depending on when the month starts. But usually it's the second Monday of October is when we have Canadian Thanksgiving. But in the States, it's the last Thursday of November, which I know is like a month and a half difference. But hey, we're here now and we're going to talk about Thanksgiving and being thankful and stuff like that. And why it's so important to be thankful. And so that's kind of today's talking topic. I mean, I totally skipped talking about this kind of thing during the Canadian Thanksgiving because, well, when it was Canadian Thanksgiving, I wasn't here because I was, doing Thanksgiving stuff. So, but since, it's technically Thanksgiving, but, where I live, we don't really observe it because I'm in Canada. We're going to talk about Thanksgiving. And so, and more of the philosophical implications of like being thankful as opposed to like a history of Thanksgiving, because I mean it's not like that one is already this is, I don't know how to word this well, but like a lot of it has been twisted, and now especially I don't know how it is in the States. It probably is not that different, but in Canada, Thanksgiving is kind of shunned upon nowadays, right? Because of course there's the heavy association with colonialism and all that stuff, and so there's a lot of negative views towards Thanksgiving, and it's one of those things where like not to be not to be harsh about it, right? Because you can't be harsh about it because people's hedonism will override their ideology, which I mean neither of those are particularly good, but you can the hedonism of the average person will override, well that's where hypocrisy ultimately comes from, right? Is because we may believe in, certain ideas. This is definitely true when it comes to like more left and woke ideologies. But you may believe certain things, or you may at least think them, but then the hedonistic side of you will say like, well, actually, I would rather do something that's a lot more convenient, right? This is why you find a lot of inconsistencies within like, feminists, for example. You find a lot of inconsistencies in what they believe and how they behave because they may believe certain things, right? But it a lot of those things actually go against of like, well, what makes me feel good, right? And that's the thing too, where it's like, sure, hedonism has it naturally leads to bad things if we don't control our desires, right? And we just allow our feelings to dictate how we do anything. But at the same time, you know, those desires are very natural things, right? And of course, civilization is about controlling and harnessing those things, right? And perhaps cultivating them to do positive things, right? But what I'm getting at is that ultimately, human beings are driven by their feelings, right? And so what you end up having is this is what leads to a lot of inconsistencies and hypocrisy in people's lifestyles, because we ultimately want to do what makes us feel good, right? But at the same time, those things more often than not will oppose ideologies, because fundamentally the thing about a lot of modern postmodern ideologies is about disregarding yourself for the sake of whether it's the government or the collective or whatever. It's the sake of some grandeur thing, which is a clear contradiction to how human beings naturally behave, which is to be self-serving. And so this is where, you know, the idea of civilization is about cultivating those things, you know, the things that make you self-serving, you know, feeding your own desires. But then you try to make them be positive and to allow those things to serve, you know, other people, right? For instance, the typical, you know, the typical man, he wants to show his strength and superiority, right? And, you know, be a tough guy, show that, you know, he's strong, physically strong, very capable of providing, you know, or okay, not the capable of providing part. We'll come to that in a second. So the typical man wants to show that, you know, he's usually this, he wants to be the strongest guy in the room, the smartest guy in the room, or whatever, right? The best in the room, basically, right? And of course, there's an evolutionary thing, right? Because, you know, that increases your prospects of mates, and then, you know, the idea of propagating to the next generation, right? So there's the evolutionary aspect to that. And so on the one hand, you know, it's so easy to be like, well, to for a guy to always just prove he's the strongest and smartest guy in the room, you know, that in itself can that can easily lead to a lot of bad things, right? Where men are overly aggressive, overly violent, right? And can be kind of controlling. So, you know, when humans were developing civilization, the idea was that, like, okay, we want to harness that because that can be used to be useful, right? You know, this man's desire to show that he's so strong, right? And so, well, how do we make that useful? Well, perhaps, you know, that strength can be used to accumulate resources well to provide for a larger amount of people or a collective, right? And this is, you know, you think of like those ideas of like the caveman days, and that's kind of how cavemen are kind of depicted, right? When you watch like any of those kind of movies, and I mean that's a once again it's a natural human evolution thing, right? And so even men to this day, you know, they a lot of guys will like to show off how smart and tough they are, and of course that can be negative when it's only used to serve, you know, their self-image. But more often than not, you find a lot of guys that go into, you know, hard labor jobs, and through that they make pretty good money, or guys that work, you know, high skill intellect jobs makes them a lot of money, and then they can use that to provide for you know, to provide for a family, and even extend that to the broader community. And so what civilization does is it takes things of like, okay, my feelings, right, my feeling of validation to be strong, right, and then to cultivate that into something useful, right, as opposed to me just parading around beating down other people and being like, haha, I'm so great, right? And so hedonism to an extent can be useful. When I say hedonism, I just mean like the general drive to do things based on your feelings, right? But of course, that obviously needs some control, right? You can't decide everything based on your feelings, right? Because then you run into other troubles, obviously, right? For example, you know, the polyamory nonsense comes from hedonism, right? And polyamory is a natural result of hedonism, right? Because it's like, well, I feel like I'm attracted to this woman today. Well, next week I'm obviously going to be attracted to a different woman. And hell, in a given day, the guy's surrounded by beautiful women. He's going to be attracted to all of them at some point, right? You can't just, you know, feel this desire of like, well, I want to get with all of them, right? Because that's ridiculous. And any sensible woman would never allow that, right? So, but, you know, that but of course, you know, we've run into the opposite problem where like, well, women justify themselves feeling that way and saying, well, polyamory is just me expressing my different forms of love. But it's like, no, we go back to the how to run a civilization. We have to harness our hedonistic notions. And so, you know, going back to feelings versus ideologies, right? Your feelings will often trump them, right? And so this is where you run into the, the big battle of why, one, a lot of, not even just religious people, but religious people definitely think this. You can think of like a lot of more conservative people in general, and conservative I mean like, not even like conservative, but like even liberals think this too, where it's like, okay, the importance of cultivating your desires to under a controlled setting to be useful, right? Because if you're just doing whatever you feel like on a whim, right? That's just, you just have people causing all kinds of anarchy, right? And then that doesn't go very well, right? Because of course the other thing too is that, a lot of bad behavior, you know what, you're going to try and justify a lot of bad behavior and things that are illegal and even outright evil, right? And so the hedonism thing is really tricky, but at the same time, I'm not, the thing that what I'm trying to get at is that you can't deny that all human beings have that desire, right? It's just like, okay, um, you know, a lot of the average like teenage boy just wants to sit around and play video games all day, right? Because it's cathartic. It feels nice to just sit down, not do any, not have no responsibilities and stuff like that, right? And do something that's like visually and visually stimulating and all that, right? And there's nothing wrong with that from time to time, right? But of course, once again, you got to cultivate that and control yourself, right? You have to control your desires. And so I totally went on a sidetrack about the hedonism thing, but going back with like, you know, the hypocrisy of a lot of ideologues, it comes from that, right? And so going back to the problem of, ideologues is, they're the ones that always force like, oh, you shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving or whatever. Back on topic, you shouldn't celebrate things like Thanksgiving because of like the colonialism, whatever. It's like, well, you may think that on an ideological level, but at the same time, like here we are in the 21st century, like you can, not to say that like, okay, all the things that obviously like people did bad things in the past, but at the same time you have to learn to live with it, right? And you can't be like, oh, because Thanksgiving's origin was like through, some pretty underhanded tactics of like colonizing the land. But I mean, to be fair, every nation's done this to some degree to someone else, right? And so here's the thing that everybody should just have in perspective. If you are part of a people group that there's a large number of you, so for instance, like, okay, like Asian people, right? If you're a Chinese person, like, let's be real, like, you are essentially the result of massive amount of conquest and by extension colonialism, right? Because, contrary to what, Maoist communist China may tell you, you know, China has been around for a very long time, for thousands of years, the Chinese people. And, how did that civilization come to be? Well, you know, a bunch of warlords fought it out. One guy came up on top and said, hey, I'm going to make us a united people with one language, the Chinese language, right? And so under that conquest that the first emperor committed, and he did a lot of pretty atrocious things. But through that, the Chinese civilization was an actual thing, right? And it was realized because of one crazy man's dream, right? To unite the people. And so, you can't really be too hard on any of that, right? And of course, in the 21st century, us living in North America, right? We can only exist here because of like, colonialism occurred. You wouldn't have a Chinese Canadian like yours truly, you know, unless colonialism happened, right? And you have, I'm not saying that like, oh, colonialism good, but at the same time is that you have to learn to live with it. But what I am saying is don't just badmouth where you come from, right? And don't just say all these negative things towards like you know, a real history and try to boycott it, because that just shows you're idiotic, right? You don't have the moral high ground when you feel like your way of getting around problems is to avoid it. So, now to the actual topic at hand, because I know I started late today, is to talk about, well, why is it so important to be thankful for what we have, right? Even though it may be easy to say, like, well, why should we be thankful for what we have? Because, Canada a bad place, right? United States a bad place, right? Why should we be thankful for what we have, right? Well, I mean, here's the thing that, contrary to popular belief, is that, life is short in the grand scheme of things, right? And I talked about this, and the time is weird. I always will make references back to that video, and you should definitely check out my Time is Weird podcast, because it does have a lot of good stuff talking about, like, how we understand time and all that. And of course, understanding, the human experience as well. Because of course, time has a certain relationship to the human experience, right? And you measure time based on that. But anyway, so in the grand scheme of things, life is pretty short, right? I mean, from your own perspective, life is long, because life is from when you live to when you die, right? And so everything in between, well, you're alive in all of it, so therefore life feels long, right? Everything else is kind of reference to your own life. But in the grand scheme of things, you think of, like, the history of the universe. You don't even have to go that big, right? But I'm just saying, like, history of the universe, your life is like, essentially like space dust, right? And in that scale. So you gotta think, like, you have the privilege of being in this world at this time, right? And contrary to what some people may tell you, this is a great time to be around. I mean, sure, COVID has obviously screwed some stuff up, but for the most part, the being alive in 2021 is actually pretty great. It's actually pretty great. And sure, there's all the naysayers out there saying that, preaching doomsday and the world's going to end sooner than later. And, I have to deal with this with, like, people within churches, right? Because everybody thinks the world's going to end soon. And it's like, well, you don't know that. And I always made this joke. It's like, if you think, to all you, like, preachers online saying you've got the date of when the Lord's coming back, I'm going to tell you this now. If you think you know the date, you don't know the date, right? I mean, if you read in, like, the book of Matthew, Jesus says, no, you won't know, because, the Lord's return will be like a thief in the night, right? And so the metaphor of the thief in the night is that you don't know and you can't know, right? And you shouldn't bother knowing, right? All you can do is you live prepared for it every day. And that's one reason why, like, okay, there are days where I don't feel like doing my Bible reading streams, because Fridays, it's hard to stay awake and read the Bible sometimes, especially on a day you have to work too, right? And then you come back online and read the Bible, and so there's a lot of times where I'm like, you know what, I'm just too tired, man. But no, I do it because it's like, hey, have someone read the Bible to people out there, and some of you may not have the Bible otherwise, right? Other than stumbling across me reading it to you, right? And what I'm getting is that, like, it's more important to live in preparation. There's all those parables that people forget about, that Jesus talks about in, like, pretty late in the book of Matthew, right? The Olivet Discourse, as many people refer to it as, where Jesus starts. Well, it all starts when, like, Jesus is standing around with his disciples, and they're like, the disciples flat out ask him, like, when is the end coming, right? When will the kingdom of God be established on earth, kind of thing, right? And then Jesus kind of tells them all these different stories that fundamentally his answer is, you don't know. But what you should be concerned about is what primarily, your belief in God. And by extension of that is serving God. And the part C of that would be how you live, right? to serve God, which then shows that you believe in God, right? And so that is what Jesus fundamentally gives them the answer to. He doesn't actually answer their question of like when, you know, the kingdom will be on earth, you know, the everlasting kingdom that the Jewish people believed when the Messiah would come, right? And place the, you know, and change the world and all that, right? And Jesus answers them like, well, you don't know, and you shouldn't, you don't need to concern yourself with it, because what good is that if you're not aligned with God? That's basically what Jesus' answer is, which is a very clever answer, right? Because, I mean, that's true, right? You think of people trying to predict the end of the world. Well, what's the point of knowing when the end of the world's going to come if you don't have your ducks in a row, right? And so from the Christian perspective, it's, well, what's the point of knowing when Jesus is going to come back if you're not living following Jesus, right? What's the point? And so that's fundamentally the answer he gives them. And so with that said, you know, we should be living our lives and be enjoying, you know, have a much more positive outlook on our daily life. And, you know, despite all the naysayers and the doomsayers, you know, no, right? It's like living in 2021 is actually pretty great. All right. I mean, yeah, there are obviously a lot of bumps in any year, right? And just because, you know, there's all these like bad events, and it's one of those things where like you think of like news medias eat this shit up, right? Where you actually you can look up statistics online where it's like, okay, like the funny thing where it's like, okay, so the amount of like say crimes in a given city is like, you know, generally on a decline, right? Compared to like, I don't know, the 1960s, 1970s, right? Where the crime was a lot higher. The crime has been steadily, you know, on a decline. But the report of crime, you know, is on the increase, right? Because, you know, the media eats that up, right? And always reporting all the bad stuff that happens, right? And, you know, you don't get as much wholesome, you know, reports. And, you know, the whole old Russell Peters joke, right? Like, no one wants to see the normal people, right? You know, the people that go for a coffee, go to work, hang out with their friends, you know, the same crap you and I do, right? No one cares about normal people, right? No one wants to watch like the news and then just read about normal people, right? That's boring. I mean, if I wanted to see the life of a normal person, I just look in the mirror, right? Like no one cares about normal people. So then of course the media has to like, okay, we have to have stories because otherwise we wouldn't have a job. And then they always tell you the crazy stories, right? Of like the bad crimes, right? Oh, it's so terrible. And you know, you think of like, once again, it's the, not to downplay when like, okay, people died to COVID and stuff like that, not to downplay any of the unfortunate victims, but at the same time, you know, the media overhyped it because ordinary people were doing just fine, right? Ordinary people figured out how to do social distancing. Normal people figured out how to wear a mask and not spread COVID, right? Normal people knew how to isolate. Normal people knew, right? But no one cares about that, right? Because why would anyone want to watch a news report about like, oh yeah, you know, the bulk of you are doing a great job, right? No one wants to hear that. Everyone wants to hear the crazy stuff, right? And so what this comes down to, you know, is that like, I want you to have the perspective of thinking that like, you know what, as we move toward the end of 2021, and of course, you know, that's another interesting thing of why American Thanksgiving is so late in the year, is because you're supposed to reflect on the year, you know. So, you know, as we approach Thanksgiving 2021 for my US friends, and I mean, it's one of those things you just think about all the time, but, you know, for, since you guys have a holiday about it, right, I want you guys to really put in perspective about, think about you know, thinking back on how 2021 was. And yeah, obviously because of like isolation stuff, and it's not been as great as we would like it to be, right? But, you know, look back and think about, you know, people you may have met online on the way, or some other accomplishments you've made, whether big or small. You know, the fact that you're still alive despite the chaos, right? I want you to look back on all that and be like, you know what? I made it through 2021, and to be thankful for that, right? We should be thankful that we've made it this far, right? Not because the world is so terrible, but because one, you know, your life is not guaranteed. And that's another thing too, that like, that's the reason why the naysaying, like fear mongering, is so powerful in people's minds. It's like we all subconsciously know that like our lives are not guaranteed, right? You're not guaranteed to live, you know, tomorrow. None of us are. But the big difference is, you know, are you thankful that you get to wake up every day? You know, and of course, you know, my Christian response would be like, you know, we got, you know, thank the Lord that I get to live each day, right? Because I get to do cool stuff each day. I get to minister to people on Discord. I get to, you know, play games with friends pretty casually. I get to go to work. I get to, you know, spend time with family more now. Now that some things have been a little bit lighter as far as the COVID thing is concerned, right? You know, I get to be so thankful for that. And, you know, you wake up in the morning, you're like, you know, thank God I get to be alive today and to do what I get to do, whatever it might be. And sure, there may be aggravations along the way, but it's great, right? We should always view that like, you know, we get the privilege to do something new each day and to, you know, carry on with life, right? And that's something I want you guys to really reflect on as we move into the American Thanksgiving, is that like, yeah, you know, 2021, you get to look back and a lot of stuff has happened. That's true, right? A lot of bad things, but think about all the good things too that you've had in your own life, right? And that's the other thing too, where like, once again, the reason why no one trusts the media, right? Because like, why would you want to trust people that are out to like, sorry, give me a sec here. Okay, I think it's good enough now. Okay, sorry about that. Thanks, you know, thanks for waiting as I bob back and forth to the noise of water pipes. But anyway, so you know, another reason why people don't trust the media in general is that like, you know, they're out there. Like, you gotta be realistic. You look at like your life in general and how your day to day living goes by, and then you think of like what the media brings into that, right? Because it's one of those things where like, you know, we as people naturally want to be around positive energy, right? We want to hear positive things from people. We want to be encouraged. We want to be told good job, you know, in the things that we do. We want to be told that, you know, we want to know when people's lives are doing great. We want to see things in our own life be great, right? And then the last thing you want is just like some person, basically a stranger to you, going like, "No, the world is coming to an end." All the naysay, right? Like, all right, come on, right? Like, you want to hear people be a lot more positive, right? And that's natural, right? Because, you know, if the world around you is positive, right, or at least you view it that way, then it's easier for you to be positive, right, and for you to make a lot more personal strides in being a better person and all that, right? Be better at your job, be better in your relationships, right? If you want to be better at that, you want to be around positive influences, right? And so you don't want people like just telling you, "Oh, the world is coming to an end," right? Because if you're around that kind of energy, it's just like, oh man, like, what's the? I mean, that's where you get nihilists from, right? And it was funny. I gotta go on this crazy tangent, right? Because I had decided to divulge a little bit because my cousins were like, "Hey, let's watch it," just because it's on Netflix, and we were watching the Cowboy Bebop reboot. Now, at first, I was kind of like, I'm kind of skeptical about the new show. I mean, the biggest problem is that, like, as an older guy, right, as an older person, yeah, I have certain like nostalgia with like the original Cowboy Bebop, right? And I was just like, excuse me, with the original, and I'm like, I've loved the original Cowboy Bebop, right? You can't recreate that, right? So any reboot will always be viewed as like an inferior, right? Because of course, in the back of your mind, you're always thinking like, oh man, it's not as good. It'll never be as good, right? You always think it'll never be as good, right? Even though I'm giving it a chance, I already know it's never gonna be as good, right? So anyway, the reason why I brought up the Cowboy Bebop thing was actually not to talk about Cowboy Bebop, but to talk about another show that had, a Japanese animation, and then it got an Americanized Netflix version, and that was the Death Note. And holy moly, that show is so bad. I me being a naysayer, right? But well, it's more of like me critiquing a show that's bad, right? And the reason why it's so bad is because the big critique I would have is that, like, well, once you change the characters, you have to change the way the story is told. But when you change the story and the way it's told, then it ends up not being the story that you fell in love with the original Death Note, for example. And then when it's not the original story, well, then it's not Death Note, right? It's Revenge of the Nerds with the Death Note, right? And that's what the Netflix version ended up being, right? Because Light Turner and Light Yagami are very different guys, right? And so in the original anime, Light views the world in a very cynical way because he views himself as being, better than, he views other people as being beneath him, right? Because of course he's surrounded by praise, and he's, you know, worshipped basically by like all the women at the school and all that stuff, right? And he's very prestigious in his academic studies, which in Japanese culture it's a thing that people adore about people, right? And they tend to be the higher, you know, people in the social strata and whatnot. And basically, when Light has his life basically put on a silver plate for him, he kind of views the world. I mean, it's the opposite of Buddha if you think about it, right? He then sees how terrible and how cruel the world can actually be, despite how perfect his own life is. And then because of that, unlike Siddhartha, Light Yagami becomes extremely nihilistic. It just says, "Oh, everything is just terrible, so why don't I, you know, play God with people?" And especially when he has a magic book that lets him do just that, right? That he can kill anyone as long as he's thinking about them when he writes their name, right? That's how the Death Note works. And so, Light Yagami's perspective is that he's very nihilistic because he views the world as like it's just a bad place because he's lived the perfect life, basically. But then the world outside of that is pretty miserable in comparison. And so he feels the need that he is the one to change it, right? To fit his image. He has a God complex, basically, right? And that shows in his nihilistic worldview, right? Whereas like Light Turner in the Netflix version, he's ostracized because being the smart guy, in North American television usually means like total nerd, right? And then when you're a nerd, you're kind of a social outcast. And so he gets access to a magic book that lets him basically play God. And then his way of going about it is, well, I'm going to get back at all the kinds of people that have wronged me in my life, right? And so it's more like Revenge of the Nerds as opposed to Death Note, right? It's just Revenge of the Nerds with the Death Note than it being Death Note. But anyway, the reason why I brought up Death Note was because it talked about, that nihilistic worldview that Light Yagami has, right? And that comes out of, too much self-worship, right? And thinking that, you're above everyone else. And that comes out of a mindset of like, well, I'm not, the, I just, what I have is, I deserve it, right? I deserve to have a great life kind of thing. And that's kind of the mindset Yagami has. And so that leads him to this very, self-absorbed worldview. And, that can obviously lead to dangerous things, especially when you have a magic book that lets you play God, right? So, yeah, it can be all the more dangerous. And so, when we put it in our own lives, right, and how dangerous it can be for us to feel like, oh, the world owes me or something, and, basically not being grateful and thinking that the world, owes you something. And that's where you get a lot of modern day nihilists, right? And, one of the things that's always been a challenge, especially doing ministry online, and online ministry is even more difficult. I used to think it was tough when I was a youth pastor, when I was like, early in my seminary years. I thought that was hard. But, when you deal with people who hide behind a screen and then part of it is like, maybe some people think they're too cool for school, and people thinking that like, well, I don't have to listen to you because, I'm just some guy, in front of a camera in Canada, right? Like, who am I, right? That's probably what many of you may think. But, well, probably everyone thinks, really, right? And, who am I to say that, like, oh, you should be more thankful in your life or whatever, right? Who am I? Where you can just be, you're too cool for school and just say what you want to say and feel like you have no, there's no penalty for it. But, I mean, there's obviously that. But what I see a lot is, a lot of these younger guys just spewing out all this nihilistic nonsense and having such a very negative outlook on life, and feeling that like, well, anarchy would be the better way of doing things. But I mean, half of that is like, I think how a lot of the young guys just want to think they're cool by saying like, well, I'm an anarchist. It's like, there's nothing really cool about that, right? Makes you sound cool, and shallow girls may find you the bad boy type, quote unquote, but then, they quickly find out that's not a good way to live. So a lot of girls will drop that act pretty quickly, especially when, and not to shit talk a lot of girls, but I've met a lot of them that like, oh, the bad boy type, a lot of girls into bad boy. It's one of those things that like I always found really crazy when I was in high school. Well, when you think of like a lot of animes, right? Naruto was big when I was in high school. And a lot of girls like Sasuke. I'm like, dude, I hate Sasuke, right? I mean, he's just a nihilistic little shit, right? That's basically what he is, by like 3/4 of the story, right? And so, like, and all the girls like, oh, he's such a bad boy. It's like, it sounds cool on paper, and I mean, to be fair, the reason why Sasuke looks kind of cool in Naruto is because if you have to contrast him with Naruto, who's an idiot, because he's an idiot, like, okay, the competition is, that's a pretty, but to be fair, Naruto's like a low bar to set for like, cool guys in anime, right? He's a pretty low bar to set. But, I hated Sasuke so much when I was like into Naruto in high school. Like, because yeah, that nihilistic mindset he has is just it's just so idiotic, right? And, how can you have such a bad outlook on life? And usually people have bad outlooks, and and to be fair, it's like, well, this is anime storytelling and writers doing whatever they want. But like, I think like manga writers knew, like, yeah, a nihilistic worldview is not good, right? It leads to a lot of destruction and misery in other people's lives. And if you have to tell a superpowered or supernatural story, those are just used to exaggerate that point, right? That you shouldn't be so nihilistic, because those people tend to be very, very destructive. But of course, coming back to our topic, well, how do you fight? How do you fight against that, right? How do you fight against that nihilistic worldview? Well, a big way to fight that is thankfulness, and to be grateful for what you have in life, right? And to be grateful that you get to be alive, and be grateful that life in general is actually pretty good, right? Contrary to all the naysayers who say, like, oh, the world's going to end if because our environment will collapse on us, or people are going to say the world's going to end because you know totalitarian governments and all that, or whatever, right? And obviously those things are real threats. I'm not saying that, like, oh, ignore them because they're not real. I'm not saying that at all. Those are real threats. But at the same time, we should be grateful that we live in a time that, like, one, medicine is pretty great in our time period, right? The fact that people can get to live longer because we can fight a lot of diseases that have killed people pretty easily en masse, right? And you go back to, like, when I did that Halloween stream and talk about, like, well, the Black Plague and stuff like that. Nowadays, a lot of, like, getting diseases from rats is pretty uncommon, and then dying to it is even less common, right? Because we have cures for stuff like that now. And so, medicine's way better. Technology makes things so convenient, right? Where, like, you can communicate with people anywhere in the world, right? You can meet people anywhere in the world, and it's a wonderful thing. You can meet all kinds of interesting people if you're not so holed up and you know so to yourself and avoiding others, right? You can meet a whole plethora of people, and that can be used to enrich your life. And that's something I really encourage for a lot of people. Say, hey, meet people, even if it's online, right? And talk to them and be authentic about who you are. And don't just be, your fedora tipping, too cool for school kind of person, right? But of course, to be fair, the internet makes that difficult as well, because of course, who can you trust? And I talked about that in the past too. But the internet allows us to do stuff like that. Of course, in my very first podcast, in the How to Knowledge, I talk about, like, well, you can basically know anything because of the internet, right? Like, imagine, like, it's one of those funny things where, like, in the ancient world, it's like getting information anywhere was extremely difficult, and people, it's so easy to look down on people in the past because it's like, oh, they were primitive. It's like, well, yeah, of course they were primitive. You know how hard it was to get information back then, let alone develop new ideas to do things, right? That was near impossible in the ancient world, right? And you had those enlightenment movements or whatever, like various movements throughout history, where people made strides in philosophy and invention and science inventions and stuff like that, because information was not easy to get back then, and to learn was not easy. But now it's like you can basically know anything, right? No information is really out of your fingertips if you just go look for it. And so it's being able to know stuff, right? Being able to talk to people, and of course, the food is great, right? You think of, like, funny things, or like, well, for example, like, okay, let's use the Bible as an example, right? And there are a lot of things that God considered unclean for people to eat, and half of a lot of it was because of, like, cleanliness issues, right? Like, the easy example is, like, okay, like pork, right? Not eating pork in like the Jewish and the Muslim world. well, Muslims obviously came a lot later, but the idea is still there, where it's like eating pork safely is a very recent invention, right? I think that was eating pork safely was probably like just after the Black Plague. I know it's weird to think that, right? Like as a Chinese person, I mean, in any Chinese restaurant, there's like so many pork, foods that we eat, right? But eating pork safely is actually a pretty recent invention, right? In comparison to like eating anything else, right? Because of course a lot of it was cleanliness issues, right? And stuff like that didn't exist. Moving on to like, you know, without resorting to talk about like the ancient world, you think of like pre-industrial, U.S. and the early 1800s. Think of like transportation. Like they had to rely on those old ass locomotives. First of all, they're expensive. Two, they take a lot of resources of like burning, you know, coals to get the thing moving. And then of course, like, you think of like those Victorian, kind of videos and movies where like people are like horse carriages and whatever, which is pretty slow, right? But now it's like, you know, traveling across the world is pretty easy to do and fast, right? Because, technology has changed so much. And, you look at all these kind of things and how great the world we live in now, right? And you got to just sit back and be like, you're thankful, first to God who lets us live in this world to enjoy all those things. And second, like the people that led those strides of inventions, right? To look back at our past and be like, thank you for doing these things, right? Coming up with like electricity, right? And having power in our houses, right? Like before the industrialization era, it's like people lit their homes with candle lights, which is like, we look at that as modern people. It's like, man, everything's a hazard, right? If all houses are basically built out of wood, right? Wood flooring and all that. And then you're lighting your house with this very thing that burns wood, right? But I mean, as moderns, we can laugh at that, but that's how people had to do things, right? But now I mean, sure, electrical power is actually more hazardous in a way. That's why good wiring is important. But you think about that as like, man, it's great to be in a time period like this. And it's one of those things that like, I always encourage people. It's like, we should be grateful for the world we live in, right? Sure, it's got problems. It's not perfect, right? But of course, my Christian response would be, you know, until God makes everything perfect, well, then nothing is ever going to be perfect, right? You just got to deal with it. And so, but instead of whining about all the imperfections, right, of the world we live in, it's, be grateful for what we have and to be thankful, right? We can thank the past for allowing us to live the lives we have now. You know, I didn't talk about this, when it was back like Remembrance Day or Veterans Day in the States. It's the same kind of mindset that we should have when we have those days, right? It's like be thankful for the people who fought, you know. And ultimately, yeah, people will talk about how like, well, World War I was so pointless, and World War II was also kind of stupid and all that, and wars in general are bad, duh, right? But at the same time, we should be thankful to the brave men and women who fought those battles, right? So that, I don't have to, right? And even in the world today, and yeah, once again, war is an ugly thing. No, like we all wish, minus the caveat that we wish no one would ever have to go to war, minus that obvious caveat. But, I'm thankful for all the people who, serve our countries, right? And fight for freedom and fight against, you know, terrorist groups and tyrannical nations, right? I'm thankful for the people who fight even today, because that's a battle I don't have to fight. Right? Think about that, right? Imagine like you had to be conscripted, which was that happened actually during World War One. That's why World War One was actually as brutal as it was, contrary to popular belief. The biggest reason why World War One was so brutal was because a lot of people that went to war didn't know how to fight, because basically people were just conscripted to fight, right? And then basically there weren't real soldiers, and it was just a bunch of like people, give them a gun and they have to fight each other. And that's the real reason why people view World War One as so stupid. And you're right to think that. But you think of like today, where we have actually like military organizations kind of thing, right? To have actual trained soldiers fight for the Joe Blows like you and me, right? And we should be thankful to those people who put their lives, in the front lines, right? You think of like when the COVID thing first struck, right? And even to this day, we're like, taking care of COVID cases, and then of course dealing with all other health issues and medical things and surgeries and whatnot. Despite all the COVID madness, right? A lot of brave doctors and nurses, doing their duty to preserve life. Be thankful that they're there, right? Be thankful that they do what they do. Be thankful for, all our workers on the ground, right? And one of the things that a lot of people correctly point out, what did COVID teach us? One of the things it taught us is that all those quote unquote lower end jobs, your fast food worker or whatever, right? Your supermarket clerk, right? They have to work because people need those things no matter whether there was a pandemic or not. Be thankful for those people that do that, right? Be thankful. Don't be an arrogant prick who feels entitled to stuff, right? I told you this story, but I'll tell it again. And this was when I was a security guard. When I was doing security work at a McDonald's, and the McDonald's is pretty terrible if it needs a security guard. I mean, forget about the bad food, right? The place itself is pretty crap when it needs a security guard. But anyway, so I was doing security guard at this McDonald's, right? And we had a guy come in, and he was waiting at the front counter, and there was no one at the till, because of course this was still pretty early in the COVID thing, right? So places like McDonald's had to get used to only having half the staff that they normally would have, right? Because of course social distancing and all that stuff, right? So a lot of places like McDonald's would have to cut their staff on a given shift in half. That's also a reason why a lot of places lost, a lot of jobs were lost during that, right? Because when you have to cut, for example, McDonald's can have 30 people normally on shift, well, you have to cut that in half to 15, right? Well, what about those other 15 people, right? Because then you can't just make everyone part-time workers, because then they're not going to make enough money, right? So eventually you have to start laying people off, and that gets kind of terrible and all that, right? But anyway, so the till at the McDonald's was unmanned, right? So this guy was standing there, and he waited for probably about a minute, and you can see the McDonald's staff, they're scuffling, around the kitchen, getting stuff done and organization things, and it wasn't easy. And especially, once again, this was when COVID was pretty new, right? And the isolation things were pretty new and all that, and social distancing and whatnot, right? And this guy had the gall to say well, where's my service, right? And he was getting impatient after a minute of waiting. And he was like, where's my service? And then, as a security guard, you never open your mouth unless you are looking. Basically, the whole kind of joke about it is that if a security guard opens his mouth, he's always looking for a fight. So the only reason a security guard opens his mouth is because he wants to fight. And so I think that's how the joke goes. But anyway, so I didn't say anything at the time, but boy, I was pissed off, right, when the guy said that, because I'm like, dude, man, we got a pandemic going on, right? We McDonald's has cut their staff. Not to mention, this is McDonald's, right? Most of these guys are like teenagers / like young adults, right? And by young adults, I mean like in their early 20s at oldest, right? Most of these guys are probably like, most of McDonald's employees are like teenagers, right? Ranging from 15 to 19, the bulk of them anyway. So, because of course, for a lot of these youngsters, man, that makes me super old when I say it like that. But for a lot of these, they're all young. It's their first jobs for a lot of them, right? And they're working to get experience. And so, what, you're going to shame a high schooler for inexperience? You're going to shame a bunch of high schoolers for, like, not being on top of the ball, at a very taxing job like fast food services or any food services for that matter? You're gonna shame a bunch of kids? Like, who do you think you are, right? And I was so ready to just like totally lay it on that guy, but obviously I didn't want to. I didn't do that because, I didn't want to pick a fight. Because of course the other thing too is if a fight did break out, it would be my fault and I would get fired and that would cause all kinds of problems. But anyway, besides the point. And it's one of those things where like the guy, like you could just tell the guy was so like he felt so entitled, right? And that behavior is so disgusting, right? I mean, I could say it's disgusting to me, but honestly, it should be disgusting to anyone. And the fact that anyone would behave that way is pretty shameful, right? I will never shame a teenager for being a useless teenager, because if you're a teenager, you're basically useless by definition. But if you're like like the guy was obviously older than I was, right? And you're gonna act in such an embarrassing way, trying to shame children, right? Like, that's where that phrase, have you no shame to pick on kids comes from, right? Like, we look down upon people like that, and rightfully so, right? Because, we tend to view people who are so self-absorbed and, revolves around themselves. A person who revolves around themselves, we use that as an insult, right? A person that's full of themselves and revolves around themselves, that we use as an insult, right? And so, that's another reason we should be thankful, so that, we don't become those kind of people, right? Because the people who do revolve around themselves, they tend to be the ones that get rejected by other people. So, once again, be thankful for the company that you have. For the most part, right? There is such a thing as having bad company. You want to avoid that. But, for the bulk of the time, you should be thankful for the company you have, right? Don't act shamefully, especially in front of your friends and whatever, right? Because, I mean, going back to the McDonald's story, it's a stranger. The security guard's a stranger, right? So if he acts shamefully, whatever, right? But imagine if he like said that in front of his friends, unless his friends are also complete assholes, right? But that, you can't be so self-absorbed that you're not thankful for what people do, right? And what people that don't need to be doing what they do, right? Like, it's the other thing too, where it's like, okay, you gotta, and this is why I'll never shame like a McDonald's worker, for instance, right? It's like, look, a lot of teenagers could just sit at home and just, sleep all day and play video games all day, because that's what most teenagers want to do, right? The hedonism thing all over again. That's what most teenagers want to do. It's just do nothing, right? Have fun, go play all the time, right? And, once again, the desire to play is a good thing. You should have that. But of course, you can't that can't be the only thing you're doing. So, these teenagers that are going to get jobs at places like McDonald's, that's a courageous thing. And so you should never shame them, right? And you should be thankful to them. You should thank them, because what's the alternative, right? Either no food services, or people that maybe should have better paying jobs have to work those jobs, right? Oh, the socialist paradise, right? But, or have other, older people work those jobs that may, that wouldn't want to be doing those kind of jobs, right? So, you gotta be thankful for those who take it upon themselves, right? And that's why, like, I have a very high opinion, actually, of McDonald's workers. A very high opinion of them. And I'm always nice to them and everything like that, right? And, that's the other thing too, when being thankful, right? It makes you a better person. It makes you a nicer person. It makes you, someone that other people would like because they see those qualities in you, right? It's one of those things that, like, when you're thankful, right, you tend to be a nicer person, right? Because when you're thankful, you're obviously not thinking negatively of others. If you're thankful and grateful to them, right, then you're not being negative. And then once again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video or this podcast, people want to be around positive energy, right? Because once again, that motivates them to be more positive, right? And so once again, it starts with you. You've got to be more thankful and grateful in your life. Of course, it's not easy. And, I talked about this in multiple videos about the importance of community. Well, we're all in this together, right? And so we should all cultivate positivity, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. And we have to work together, right? Because, there's going to be days I don't want to be positive. It's just the way it is, right? Life can be hard at times. And there's days where I don't want to be positive. But when you and other people around me are positive, well, then that will motivate me. And then vice versa. There's going to be days you're not going to want to be positive. That's just a matter of fact, right? But, I hope myself and others around you would cultivate that positivity that you need, to push you forward in the day. And that's why we need to be thankful for each other, right? And those that we have in our lives, to be thankful that we have them, right? Because we affect each other way more than we think we do, right? We all have bigger impacts in people's lives than we think we do on our day-to-day basis, right? That's something important for us to always think about. That, yeah, you matter because you make an impact in someone's life, and hopefully a positive one. And that's why we need to be thankful and grateful for each other, because that will also give us the strength to move forward. And as we end 2021 and move into 2022, oh my god, it's weird to think that's going into 2022 soon. But as we move into 2022, right, all the more reason, right, that we need to be thankful and grateful. And as we I hope you guys enjoy your American Thanksgiving, and to reflect on that. What are you thankful for? You're thankful that God gets to let us keep living, and then of course thankful for each other to push us forward as we keep living, right? So always be thankful. It's important. It will make your life better, and then you can make other people's lives better. And that's what we need, right? We need life to be better. Well, it's not going to happen if we're not thankful and grateful for what we have. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. So some endamble. I mean, what do you call a epamble? Epamble. Well, a preamble would be like prologue, right? So an amble, chatting, and pre is before. So what do we call the post, right? Would it be like post-amble, or is it epamble? I don't know. Put your opinion in the comments. But anyway, in this epamble, just a little bit of a talk about where we're gonna go with the channel now that December's approaching. Because I mean, we still have another Monday in November, but I kind of will treat it like, oh, we're in December. Because I mean, what day is it next week? Next week is the 29th, I think. 29th of November, which is basically like the second last day, right? So we must just say that we're in December at that point. So when December rolls around, first thing, I'm gonna be gaming on this channel again. I think I've had a long enough break with the 4 months. I know, or 3 months, sorry, from September to November, right? Excuse me. I think 3 months. I had a pretty good break, and trying to find new content to play. of course, the irony of saying that is that the first thing I'm gonna play is actually gonna be, we're gonna redo something on this channel. We're gonna play something that we've already played on this channel, but we're gonna add spice to it, right? We're gonna add some spice to it, and that's gonna be a grand old time. So keep your eyes peeled for that. That does mean that we will be moving streams, earlier once again, right? Because when I do these podcasts, um, they're a little later, right? But well, the podcast will still be a podcast, but Wednesday we'll be back with games. We'll be playing again on Wednesdays, and Wednesdays we'll have a longer stream as well. And of course, for December we'll start light. We'll only do Wednesdays, but I'm going to also take a break from Throwback Thursdays eventually. Of course, this is on a couple of conditions, right? Because I'm still playing Heroes of Might and Magic 2, The Price of Loyalty on this channel. The first condition is if you guys want to actually watch me play the Wizard's Isle campaign, because I'm debating not doing that. But at the same time, some of you might feel like, oh, it's not the full Let's Play if we're not doing like, all the campaigns, right? Because I'm just starting Price of Loyalty this week. The Price of Loyalty campaign, not the game, but I can easily see where you'd be confused. So we're gonna be doing. So basically, when that ends, when Heroes 2 ends, whether we finish with the Price of Loyalty campaign or actually play the Wizard Hour campaign. But I feel like if that ends up being the case, we're gonna play all the way till like March or something. Whatever the case, though, when that ends, we'll do gaming streams on Wednesday, Thursdays, and not do Throwback Thursday. I'm gonna take a break from Throwback Thursday for a while, and we'll do streams on Wednesday, Thursday. We'll keep the podcast on Monday, and we'll keep the reading on Friday, but we're gonna add streams in the middle of the week. Of course, that means we'll have to stream early on those days, but that's gonna be something that's coming up. So, I mean, to be fair, when next week rolls around, we'll have our first Christmas podcast kind of thing. And then, December 1st, which I think is a Wednesday, isn't it? December 1st? Yeah, December 1st is a Wednesday. And, we'll be playing a game on the channel again. So, like in stream format. And I'll have guests hang out with me and whatnot in those videos. So, you guys can join the community and we're going to have a grand old time, right? Spend Christmas together laughing about dumb crap and playing games, right? So that's going to be a thing. We're going to be going back to that. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that. And that's the only really big thing for December, because once again, I already mentioned, we're going to do some Christmas related stuff with like podcasts and of course our Bible reads. Because I'm going to finish the Book of Kings pretty soon, probably in 2 weeks. So this week and the next week. So this week, which would be the 26th, and the 3rd of December, we're going to finish the Book of Kings. So then that would give us like 3 weeks. Yeah, we'll do 3 weeks of like Christmas related Bible reading streams, which is actually a lot. Usually most people do that in one. But we're going to do 3 weeks of Christmas kind of related Bible reading streams starting from the 10th, right? So a lot of Christmas related stuff coming up, but the big thing I want you guys to keep your eyes peeled for is that we will start games on this channel again starting on the 1st of December. So I want you guys to keep your eyes peeled for that. You can always hit the subscribe and the bell notifications for the notifications of when I start doing that. But yeah, that's basically the heads up of what's going to be going on with this channel and some small, changes. Of course, I still need to check out with a buddy, and we're going to work on actually redesigning this screen, right? Because I know you're probably tired of like this half-ass, camera here and then like an image over or here, right? So you guys are probably tired of that by now. And I want to actually have an actual design come up, so I need to talk to a guy and he's supposed to make a design for me. So anyway, that's kind of how it is. And how it's going to be for the next little while. So I hope you guys are excited for that. Anyway, it's 5:20. I know it's going to be like, I mean, kind of whatever. We're already been in here for like an hour and 15 minutes. So ended a little earlier for the stream, but I don't have anything else to say. So anything I've wanted to say, I've said it already. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you guys Thursday for Heroes of Might Magic 2. I hope you guys, take care of yourselves and to always be thankful. Hope you guys have a great day and God bless you.